and we are able to start the track 3 session. But before that, there's an announcement. Oh, acha. Just a minute, let me note it down. And this is available there. Rajiv Sachar. Rajiv is Isar, right?
I think he's gone upstairs because that is what.
Yeah, there's some confusion. Yeah. Madam Jawala, are you ready? Yeah. There is a small announcement. We have with us Renana Jawala. She is chairperson Bhav Seva Bharat. She has a book, an interesting one, The City Makers, which is really very, very relevant. How women are building a sustainable future for urban India. She wants to, but she has only 10 copies with her. One she has given to me, so 9 are available now.
Yeah.
And she will be keeping it here. And those who would like to have a copy, each copy, you can have it. But I know. No, at the moment it is free of cost, as she has told me. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I
So
about
please,
the book.
can you? Yeah.
So thank you so much, Mr. Verma. And my name is Renana Jhabwala. I am actually chairing TF6. Work 6. And it's the gender-led development, which is a major, as you know, theme in G20. And in the urban areas, as I have seen, there is very little on women-led development. So, Ajay, Mr. Hassan. Talking, Mr. Hassan, about women-led development. And in what does women-led development mean in the urban areas? So we have had over 20 years of experience and studies of looking at women-led development in the urban areas. And we've done a book here called City Makers. So I had, unfortunately, this came out in the middle of the COVID crisis. And so we were not able to at the time publicize it. So now we have started. And I have 10 books here, which I would like to give out. This is available on Amazon, so if anybody wants to buy it, or if anybody would like a copy, you could write to me. So I'd like to leave it here. I must say it's women at the lower 50%, not all women, but women at the lower 50%, how they contribute to making the city. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I have been instructed by the organizers that I will have to close this session by 4:20. So it is already 3:45. So 4:20. By 4:20, I have to close it. So we have got 4 speakers who are physically present and make a physical presentation, and 1 speaker will be online. So in a way, at the most we have got 30 or 35 minutes. So to each one I can allocate 6 minutes or so. So we can concentrate only on the main points. Well, just as an introduction, 2, 3 things I would like to mention. Now, the first thing is that, that life for environment is really a very, very serious issue that we are now very much concerned about it. The reason is that, environmental degradation has its lots of costs, and the costs are numerous, and these figures are available in the literature. According to one figure, that the annual loss is somewhere around $5 billion. If we go by the current environmental degradation, more because of the climate change. And if we do immediately something about it, this loss can be reduced to $1 billion in a year. So loss in any case, it will be there because, this environment degradation is a natural kind of the thing, but more serious is the man-made natural degradations. And we have seen it very recently here in India, abroad also, the kind of the tragedy in Uttarakhand that has taken place in the UK, this UP also, something is happening. This is the first thing I wanted to emphasize. The second I want to emphasize is that recently, in the previous session, I heard three views, and those are really very, very interesting. One view is that we should start with small investment instead of thinking about the big investments, because the big investments are coming forth or not. There's a divergence of opinion. The one opinion is this, that we should start from small investments in infrastructure, in environment, and other things. But there's a second very interesting viewpoint. Dr. Bhanumurthy mentioned it there. This is that, no, Dr. Bhanumurthy mentioned this. The second one is that lots of funds are available. We should not bother much about it. Lots of funds are available. So that is not, the funds are not the problem. But there's a third viewpoint which I read here, that the funds available are far below the optimum. So we have three positions here. This is one thing. There is one challenge before us. What is our stand on it? What is each one of us on this? Whether we should start only with a small investment and we should not think too much big about it, or secondly, we should think that lots of funds available, we should not feel worried about it. The problem probably is one of the optimal allocation of the resources, its efficient use and all those things. And the third is that, which I have read it from the literature, that the funds available are far below the optimal. These are the three issues. But the cost, in any case, everybody say, cost of environmental degradation, whether it is the natural or it is the man-made or the case, there are sea changes also in the coastal areas, also special problem, particular areas, special problems are being faced across the world. So those issues are there. But the issue is that, what is the situation? Because the problem is that, the need for funds is so big, which is generally believed, commonly believed, that it is the nations are finding it very hard to infrastructure investments. In any case, this is the second thing we need to think about. And the third thing is that what are the possible avenues from which we can be three mainly which have been emphasized. One is the public, private, and the philanthropic foundations. They are providing funds for this purpose. Now I leave this this platform to the eminent panelists and invite first Dr. Rana Hassan. Dr. Rana Hassan is a Director, Development Economics and Indicator Division, ADB, New Delhi, India. Dr. Hassan, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Verma. It's really excellent to be here at these meetings and also participate in this. Now, since time is short, I'll try to get to my points very quickly. First, since we're talking about cities, it's good to just think about some numbers. So currently, a couple of years ago, we passed this mark where the UN had projected about 50% of the world's population was living in urban areas. And the projections based on various demographic trends is that by 2050, we're going to have about 2/3 of the world's population in urban areas. We're going to be seeing existing cities expanding, and we're going to be seeing new cities starting to emerge. Now, a lot of this growth is going to be taking place in the developing world. First of all, given this close relationship between economic growth and urbanization, this relationship that we've seen historically, this should be good news. It should mean, more prosperity, etc., and one can take satisfaction in that. But the difficulty is actually twofold. First of all, unlike that historical experience, what we are seeing in the last 20, 30, maybe 40 years is urbanization without cities playing this dynamic engine of growth. So we have many cities all over the developing world. You have a lot of agglomeration of people, and economic theory tells us that when you bring people and firms together, you should see increases in productivity. But unfortunately, we seem to be seeing a lot of cities where that's not the case. You're seeing the people, you're seeing them concentrated, you're not seeing that economic dynamism. Certainly, they may be living better off than they were when they were in rural poverty, but that's really a low bar. So that's issue number one. The second problem has to do really with climate change, the forces that have caused all these greenhouse gases and the forces that are making things work, air pollution, degradation, etc. And for various reasons, most importantly, economic activity and people are getting concentrated in tiny areas. You're seeing a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions. For example, 70% of these seem to be emitted from cities. A lot of the air pollution that you're seeing is emanating from cities, etc. So you have these two challenges. Cities are growing. They may not be as vibrant engines of growth as they were, let's say, when Europe developed. And number two, we're seeing this whole issue of climate change. Cities being part of the problem, but also facing the brunt of flooding issues and extreme weather events, etc., will be hitting cities and our infrastructure very hard. So what do we do about these? How do we manage our cities better? And this is where I come to some of the points that Dr. Verma was making. Several challenges. First of all, it's that investment in urban infrastructure. That was one of the topics also given over here. There's a massive need. Water supply, sewage systems, solid waste management. We need better transport networks, good public transport. We need accompanying social infrastructure. We need housing that is affordable. Currently, and I would hazard a guess, in every developing world's major cities, the land prices are skyrocketing relative to the incomes that people have, and affordable housing is really, we talk about it, but yeah, there's housing. It's not necessarily affordable, nor is it decent housing. So we have this problem with social infrastructure, not to speak of health and issues and deficiencies in education that may be there for the bottom 50% of the population of these cities. There are various estimates out there. So whether you look at the World Economic Forum's numbers or the Global Infrastructure Hub, or our team at ADB made some numbers, and basically what we said is, our region, Asia Pacific, developing Asia Pacific, so that's basically excluding Japan, needs about $1.7 trillion per year. And we are, of that, about 70% it needs to be for urban infrastructure. We are missing it. And once you take out China's contribution to the actuals, we are missing it even more. So there really is this big infrastructure gap. And yet, as people say, and Dr. Verma, you were making this point, there's a view that, no, don't worry, there's money around. Now, we think that actually the money is there. The problem is it's not flowing. It's not flowing to this type of infrastructure that cities need. It's not flowing to the water supply, the sanitation networks, solid waste, etc. It's just not going over there. And for this, in fact, just to give you some numbers, in the last 10 years, the private sector investment in infrastructure has been about 180 billion, and it's been pretty much stuck at this level. And by the way, only 25% of these billions are actually going to developing countries' cities. This gap between what's needed and what financing is needed and what private sector financing is actually just going wider and wider. Now, how do we tackle about this? I think fundamentally, the ball is in the public sector's court. And the public sector is going to need to do a couple of things before this private sector is going to flow. Because, I mean, if, you know, there's one thing, I think the private sector, there might be certain parts which are benevolent, etc., but the private sector ultimately is going to be drawn by profits and return on investment. And so the types of things that I think we have to focus on, and paradoxically, the first one is really not really relying on the private sector. It's cities have to increase their own resource revenues. Things like property taxes are not being used sufficiently in the developing world. City after city, property tax systems are just not keeping in pace with the value of the land that people are owning. It's not keeping pace with even the incomes that those landholders are making. So I think property taxes have to be used. User charges, a controversial area, but there are methods by which you can charge where you can have user charges which you know, do a nice cross subsidization role. So affordable user charges. There are many people who can afford the user charges. They're not paying for them. That kind of system has to stop. And I think digital technologies really gives us opportunities on this. And we also need to start using tools like land value capture. And I know time is short, Dr. Verma. I'll just end with two examples of what I mean by this. If we look at Indian cities, for example, we're building metros all over. And that's a very nice thing. A metro on its own is improving your mobility. But really, you know, if you look at the cost side of a metro, the costs are pretty much the same everywhere. You have to drill these tunnels, you have to put up these bridges, etc., lay the tracks, buy the rolling stock. The costs are relatively fixed. It's the benefits. The benefits, to really get the maximal benefits of metros, you need to have that complementary investment in secondary, tertiary road systems. You need to have the investments in the last mile connectivity for people to get to the station. And most importantly, you need proper land use planning, land zone, land regulations, building bylaws. And I think we really need to modernize these, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get compact cities. All these metros are going to do is just go on creating more and more sprawl. More greenhouse gas emissions, etc. A final point, you had raised this about degradation. And I think, again, land use planning. We really have to invest in master planning. I don't really know the situation that much outside South Asia, but I can tell you in South Asia, we really underinvested in the capacity of our urban planning. And that's something that just cannot stand. Because whether you want to, you know, use a particular site as a nice tourism site, how you manage that land, how you make sure that the natural capital gets retained, how you make sure you don't have sprawl, really requires good planners. So in a session on finance, I'm ending with this plea that it's not just about finance. You get these other things right, including getting the urban planning things right, that the money will start to flow. Thank you.
The points raised are really very relevant. In any case, at the end, if time permitted, maybe some sort of summary I could deliver. Now I invite Mr. Preetam Banerjee. No, sorry, I have wrong page. Dr. Devolin Kundu, Professor, NIUA, New Delhi.
Thank you, Jay. It's very difficult to speak after Dr. Rana has spoken because he has almost preempted me. I would reiterate what he has already said in maybe in a slightly different manner. He did mention about the world's urbanization prospect data. I think by 2030 will be 60% urban. Existing cities are growing, new small towns are coming up. And basically this is happening. This is a trend more so for the global south. Asia is urbanizing, which will flatten in a few decades, but Africa will pick up. And what he mentioned is very correct. We see an increasing trend of urban sprawls coming up. And this is not only restricted to the global south, it's a phenomenon also of the global north, and we did a study for India where we found 88% of the districts in India, the rate of increase in urban sprawls is higher than, the built up areas is higher than that of population. So this is a major area of concern. And a recent report by the World Bank and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery also argues that climate change and increasing urbanization may have devastating effects, and this will strike hardest the biggest drivers of global development. And the low resilience of growing cities is particularly dangerous for the urban poor. So cities are not homogeneous spaces. We have the urban poor and the elites. So the urban poor who are more precarious will be the most hard hit because they are occupying the marginal lands, and they have lesser access to resources. But there is some reason for optimism because 60% of the areas which will be urbanized are yet greenfield. In India, we see the increasing number of census towns which are being added, which are rural by governance. So if we could start resilient infrastructure in these spaces, I think much of the problems could be solved because no more retrofitting is needed, because these are all pristine areas which have become recently urban, and here investments in a properly thought of manner could really help the current population and also the future populations to come. And one thing very important is investment in the small and medium towns. I think that is one area which has been ignored, not only here in the global south, not only in Asia, but also in cities of Africa, where small towns are increasing. And one of the mechanisms could be pooled financing, which will give access to capital market. And one point which has been very correctly pointed out by Dr. Rana is that cities need to really come up with innovative sources of financing. And also the small towns, when we look at the size class level of income earnings from the taxes, the small towns do not have the capacity to raise resources. So until and unless we fix our houses, things won't happen. So I think the small and medium towns really need to find out ways of increasing their property taxes and user charges. And urbanization in Asia has been basically messy and unplanned. So master plans really need to bring in innovative sources of financing, have proper planners, because if you look at the cities of majority of the cities of the global south, we do not have trained urban planners. For most of the urban planners, because of the curriculum, they are very challenged with data. Until and unless a planner can work with data, things won't happen. So both financing and planning needs to go hand in hand. And the last point which I would like to make is that there needs to be more of synergy between rural development and urban development. Because if you look at these two streams in silos, things really won't work out in an integrated fashion. Because the rural spaces just now will become urban in a few decades. So until and unless we think about synergizing the rural and the urban spaces and bring in investment, which needs to be resilient, I don't think proper development will happen. I stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Kundu. The point raised is almost similar to what Dr. Hassan has said. But the point, the optimism you have expressed a little, that 60% of the urban areas are yet to be developed. And if we prepare our, strategies right now, towards making the cities resilient, probably we can mitigate the adverse impacts of, the likely adverse impacts of environment degradation in future. Thank you very much for raising this issue. And now I invite Dr. Jyoti Chandira Mani. Chandira Mani. Yeah, this is sometimes difficult to, from the other part of the country. Anyway, so she is a respectable lady. Dr. Jyoti, she is director, Symbiosis School of Economics, SIU Pune, India.
Good afternoon, everybody. Am I audible? Yeah, I think so. SIU stands for Symbiosis International University. Just to clarify that. Again, I think it's going to be the old wine in the new bottle, but I'll try to put it across a little differently. The global governance has really, from 1972, the first Earth Summit in Stockholm. And from there onwards, you've been finding values that have been, nurtured around. Cities, at least in India and South Asia, have really got more prominence in the 90s. But whereas we have a lot to look at, the other part of Asia and the rest of the world from where we can take good examples to kind of fit in. But there are two axioms that I'd like to use, when it comes to cities. In India, in South Asia, they are Janus looking. They look at the past and then they plan the future. They're also palimpsest by nature because you have layers of, civilizations that are there. So you're planning over planning over planning, and therefore they are bound to look messy and hidden. Going by certain data, where, the urban, we are 8 billion population, 56% is urban. That almost makes it 445, 4.45 billion, which is urban, and 75% greenhouse gases come from there. So the very fact that you talk about a resilient city, you're talking about cities need to endure. That itself is such a negative connotation. I think we need to get sensitized. From morning, I've been hearing about how values need to come in. So values definitely need to come in how you rebuild a city and build with the given resources that are there. Because I think the innovative mind of the human, 8 billion humans, can always be very creative. So looking at that, there is no doubt that at this turn of the third decade of the 21st century, we've had financial crisis globally. We've got the pandemic and a lot of health crisis since the 21st century has come out. And then you've had the challenges of global warming, which have got accentuated. And then you've got the geopolitical framework that is coming out. Now, within this, the city has to probably function because we are coupled with the rest of the world, as the rest of the world is coupled with each other in a number of ways. The SDGs, which were announced in 2016, and the Millennium Development Goals kept environment very much at the core. And therefore, cities' functions have changed. The very fact that cities' functions have changed, then are we able to have we able to institutionalize the functions of a city? I mean, that's the first thing that I feel that cities have to have a capacity to become resilient. And I can see that language has changed. I can see where in the past, if there was any public-private participation in terms of water, where water was to be charged, I talk about even between 2011 and 2015, it was looked at very negatively. Today, you have Surat having a public-private participation. I'm just taking an anecdote out here and giving an example where wastewater is recycled and sold, and the municipal corporation is actually earning revenue out of resources in a very ingenious manner. Indore, for that matter, is having its own carbon credit. So these are certain ingenious manners in which we don't only have to look within India, but we have to look all over to find the best practices. And G20 is going to be this framework, which is going to give us the best practices that we can share with each other. So having said this, as I said, the SDGs are there, but when you look at the functions of the cities, are the cities empowered to handle all these functions? Do they have the capacity that is there? Some of it is, of course, is different. So we've, from again 2016, we've had the national determined contributions, the NDCs, the Paris Agreement, and therefore a new set of functions, as I again repeatedly say, has come up for the cities. And then you look at the root cause analysis to where we have reached. Why have we reached here? And how do we go back to the root and address it and nip it at the very base at which it is? So according to the WMO Atlas of Mortality and Economic Losses from Weather,
climate and water extremes. Between 1970 and 2019, there were more than 11,000 reported disasters attributed to various hazards globally. And there were just over 2 million deaths. So death is not the real amount, but it is the disaster and the destruction that comes out, and which has been, quantified at 3.64 trillion losses. So looking at this, definitely cities will have to be very, very oriented towards making a plan. Now, when you want resilience, you have to have a resilience plan and then finance. So we have environment status reports, we have comprehensive mobility reports, you have city development plans. We only talk, but where is the action that comes out of that? So I think that's what really needs to happen. That's especially there in the South Asia context. So assessment of setting the agenda. Exactly where cities have to say, this is what we do in the short term, this is what we do in the long term, medium term, this is what can be used with local resources, this is what we can borrow from the international market. And with the different tiers of federal structures that are there in different economies, it cannot be left to the city only to manage it. It will have to come with the support of the next tier, whether it's the state, the center. Definitely you can't just put the whole responsibility on the city, because the framework of every country is different. If a key tax that was a city's enabling sustainable financial tool is taken away, then there's going to be a challenge in that too. For example, in India, the GST. So therefore, 1% of the GST has to go back to the cities. There is no doubt, if the world GDP is today at $100 trillion approximately, and you look at the data of the gross savings ratio of the world, it's between 22 to 27 to 28%. That means at any given point of time, 22 to 28 trillion dollars is available. And I think Rana specified the amount, so that money is there, but the multilateral agencies need to be restructured, or they have to be pushed in some kind of a manner where this money is going to find its way in the right way of humanity, etc. So values, even at multilateral agencies, will have to change. So my point here is, my last concluding points and takeaways from here is, cities do not have the capacity to absorb investments in a timely manner. So capacity building of cities to be able to get this investment, even if hypothetically you put money in the hands of a number of cities in developing countries, they would not be able to furnish that as easily. But today, of course, they have become, again, very much with consultants and private partnerships. So the PPP model does work sometime. Cities could go to the bond markets. And as I said, there is that amount, but then they are not even ready with the credit rating for that. So that's another way. Innovative funding, as I talked about, carbon credits, I talked about water treatments. These are just some ways of looking at it. And to close, when we look at large projects in cities, especially transport is a very neglected topic in cities, because it's just left to the private sector, private transport that comes in. And financing a city for its resilience means having very good urban transport. And that doesn't mean 58 to 60 or 70 kilometers of metro at the rate of 250 to 300 crores for 1 kilometer, or 550 for an underground, but probably e-buses at the rate of 1 crore, with cities having the typical benchmark ratio of for every 1 lakh, you have 50 such transports. And the worst part is census towns that Devalina talked about, or the new towns that are coming up. They have absolutely no public transport system. So you're going to push private transport. The root cause analysis that I said is going to be neglected is going to come from here. You need to see that supply creates its own demand in its way, that you'll need to create these public transport buses and investments everywhere, that it becomes easy to discourage private transport. Otherwise, your nationally determined contributions that you have fixed are just not going to be realized. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jyoti. And now I invite Dr. Bishwajit Roy Chaudhary from South Asian Institute for Advanced Research and Development, Kolkata. Dr. Roy Chaudhary, please.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, the honorable participants as well as the distinguished speaker. So I will directly come to the point because the theme which we have we're discussing here, that is the financing resilient cities and societies. So the term there is, I think there are the 3 points that are very important. That is the cities, its resilience as well as the finance. So now, as an urban geographer, I'm being a chairman of this SIAD. Along with that, I am an urban geographer. So I thought that every city has different in its on the basis of its dynamicity and its nature of development, and the funds and the financial models which we are thinking it's for its development. I mean to say that is the sustainable development coined the term. That is, there are 2 types of funding we can get. That is the direct funding and indirect funding. So direct funding, which is government particularly provided to the city officials and the city governance, along with the on the basis of the city governance, you know, the system through which the funds has been actually transferred to the development of the cities. But most of the cases we don't focus particularly, which I feel that in case of the indirect fund generation, and until or unless one city can become if they wants to become a resilient and if they become to financially strong, then they have to utilize their own resources, which I feel, and on the basis of that resource utilization, that I am to coin the term, that is the resource mobilization. And we, until or unless the city are in develop their own resource, generate their own resource, they are generate their own funds through the resource mobilization by generating the human resource which they have, and by generating the by supporting developing the infrastructures, by developing the natural resources which they have. It will not be possible because this discussion, it will be a continuous process. It will not be an end. So for that, I thought I just pointed out several points on that basis of which I feel that city can be resilient and financially can be, it will be strong. So first, for the resource mobilization, we can go for the PPP model, as all our panelists also shared, and now the term is for time is for collaboration. So in that sector, there will be the as an academic institutions, we are also thinking that UGC, you know, the University Grants Commission mentioned the term, that is the academy industry collaboration. I am saying that why not academy, industry and government collaboration, because these trial can obviously support. And not only that, if we go far beyond that, we can also connect the stakeholders, that is the NGOs and the industry officials, those who are also associated, those who are connecting with the cities. So together we can utilize the funds through the resource mobilization which we have. And this, so PPP model, private public partnership model concept, has to be changed somehow. Second, empowering the local communities by developing the urban entrepreneurship model. It's very important, which I feel, because if we just take an example of agriculture sector or the farming sector, most of the cities are depend on their agriculture and food sector for the rural and suburban areas. But now the concept of urban farming is not very new, but it's already prominent. But most of the cities are neglecting their resources. I mean, the another issues, that is we already mentioned, or always mentioned, that is the solid waste management. So if we prepare a proper development plan, how we can utilize the solid waste, and up to that it can convert it into the agriculture, for the agricultural fertilizers, and through that fertilizers we can utilize the high-rise building, rooftop of the high-rise building, and we through that we can generate the urban entrepreneurship model, and which will also support the lots of people. Until or unless our family members can generate income, if they only depends on the father's income, automatically it will, the development and the livelihood sector will be hampered. So I think empowering local communities by such kind of small practicing model should be very required for the city's financially required development. Third is the developing the local ULBs by capacity building. Most of the ULB peoples are not equipped in coming technology. They are still now focusing on the same pattern, and so we have to focus. That is the how we can develop the urban local bodies through the different technological utilizations and all that. Yes. Next, urbanization. Property tax management through the smart technology, and incorporation of the technology smartly, not just utilizing the smart technology. So please understand. Next, proper land use, land cover planning, as already our panelist mentioned.
promoting the urban tourism. It's a very important part through which we can generate our funds very well. Self-resilient city planning model should be developed at a micro level points. Next, incorporation of urban awareness program from the very basic level from education institutes, and that is the requirement for the government. And now the model of green slum, I think we are also working in a project that is the green slum, how the cities are mostly affected by the slum and their space occupation and all their environmental social problems are related. So if we focused on the development of the slum area into the green slum model, so it will be better for us. And next, urban financing strategy should be developed on the basis of that. So these are the some points which we have to mention, and we on the basis of that, I think that urban sustainability, which is not just an awareness or just a concept, it's a practice. We should practice it thoroughly and properly with a proper manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. Probably we are moving towards a consensus, a sort of consensus where we are emphasizing that the city should be able to mobilize their own resources and they should prepare their own plans so that they can achieve some optimal utilization. Now we have a last speaker, Mr. Rajiv Isar. Mr. Rajiv Isar is a policy specialist, climate risk and risk governance and thematic head urban resilience UNDP USA. He will be speaking online. So I invite Mr. Rajiv Isar. So can you tell me who? He's online, right? Dr. Sir, we have got only 5 minutes now for you, already short of time. So maybe broad points, maybe 3-4 broad points which you can raise here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dr. Verma. Thanks, distinguished fellow panelists. Many of the excellent points have already been made. I will just touch upon 2-3 key points to further contextualize this discussion today. When we are speaking about financing resilient cities and societies, what is resilience that we are talking about? So if we look at the understanding of the term resilience that is coined by the Chief Executive's Board of the UN, we understand it to be an inherent ability of an individual, any society, entity, organization, a community, or a country to prevent, to resist, absorb, adapt, and recover efficiently and effectively without compromising the long-term sustainable development objectives that it has in front of it. So obviously it means that it is not an end by itself, but resilience is a means towards achieving a longer-term sustainable development objectives. Second, when we speak about this, what is so we are building the resilience to what? There are certain risks and challenges that we are clearly seeing being manifested in the urban context today. And these are risks and challenges of all typologies. It's not just disaster events, climate change, but number of other challenges and deficits which are manifesting themselves in an urban area that need to be addressed simultaneously along with some of the underlying drivers which tend to magnify their impact, as well as the inherent vulnerabilities. Second point connected there too is that when we are speaking about a resilience, it is a risks too that we see there and the risks from. So there is a risk development interface that we clearly need to better understand, given that much of the challenges that we face today have either a developmental or a social construct. So many of these challenges or the risks that we speak about against which we need to build a resilience, they need to be understood and analyzed properly. This also assumes importance given the fact that there is already a convergence of people, development assets, many of these socioeconomic activities and other processes in the urban areas, which is leading to urbanization of these risks and urbanization of many of the development challenges, including poverty, including discrimination, marginalization, etc., which were earlier associated more with either a rural or semi-urban areas. Third point, we at UNDP undertook an analysis of the past decade of investments in urban resilience building globally, and some of the key points which stand out in terms of helping us identify what are the existing demands and emerging needs there. One, the focus in the past decade has primarily been on big metropolitan cities. So that's a gap that we clearly need to understand. Second, it has been oriented more towards the large infrastructure development, projects and assets, or like bridges or something like that. Third, this resilience building analysis and investment has largely been investment oriented, in the sense that how do IFIs and the private sector and others make their investments, and how can that continue to generate the returns that it is envisaged to do. There has been little or no focus towards the socio-economic development processes, as well as the assets in that that process. Then next, that the risk dimension of building the resilience has not been addressed at all in our past decade of investments, which means that many of the not just large scale disasters, but even some of the everyday risks and the challenges that we see in an urban area have not been addressed adequately. And another aspect being that this resilience, building is largely seen as external driven and not internally, instituted or built upon. Taking the cognizance of these needs and the gaps, we have developed a strategy, which specifically looks at addressing the needs of the small and the medium cities, as well as the emerging towns, especially in many of the challenged development context, which is the LICs, the SIDS, and other, countries in a similar, context. Secondly, the urban governance elements, they need to be definitely addressed more often. Third, the marginalized or the social, economic aspects of building the resilience need to be looked at. Fourth, the risk-informed development that has not been really spoken about, when we are speaking of building the resilience at the city and the societal level, and largely the application of digital technologies. So these are the 5 areas that we are trying to address more. And in coming to specifically to the financing side of the equation there, how do we augment public-private funding to strengthen urban resilience investments? One, of course, this point has already been emphasized sufficiently, that we need to strengthen and expand the domestic revenue streams within the cities. To add on to that, another suggestion could be that we need to engage more and more of non-governmental actors like the private sector to foster these investments. So this resilience building should not just be seen from the prism of an administrative domain, but largely an multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approach. Third, facilitating cities' access to international funding systems or instruments. So how do we do that? Building their capacities, enabling them to understand how these instruments work, and enabling them to develop some of those bankable investment projects and proposals. So we are working with a large number of cities to help them address all these issues simultaneously. One point that might need to be further discussed as part of the Think 20 series is that can a recommendation about setting up a global urban resilience fund could be thought of, which could have a potential focus on streams like the physical infrastructure or the socioeconomic development assets. Environmental resilience, this point has been raised today, but I think it's increasingly important in the context of the cities. Then the digital and the new technological innovations and urban governance. I think these are the things that we clearly need to focus a lot upon when we are speaking about financing resilient cities and communities. One gap which might again need a bit more of a thinking is about how do we develop some of those benchmarks to measure how cities are doing or progressing towards a resilience building scale. There is no universal benchmark, and some of our deliberations today and going ahead might also need to focus on that in terms of identifying some of those indicators and the benchmarks to help cities assess and monitor their own work and investments on this scale. So in short points for and in the interest of time, I will pause here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rajiv ji. Thank you very much. The points raised are really very, very relevant. I think the major point which is coming up as a consensus point is that, rather than looking towards the external sources, we should look more towards our own internal resources. And we have suggested, a property tax is one way, and there are other, but the basic issue probably is that, it's, of course, you have your own viewpoint, it's not adequate. Of course, that's true. That is, what is the capacity at the subnational level, maybe at the city level or the local level, to collect these sources, whether they have got the jurisdiction to enter into such kinds of the things or not. And particularly when, if you look at the third level of democracy, like the Panchayati Raj institution, local bodies, no, actually they are not even given those basic functions which were enshrined in the 73rd amendment in the Constitution. And they do not have their resources also. Though there are some states, Kerala is doing quite well over there, but not in Punjab. In several other states also in Punjab, 4 or 5 functions have been given, allocated only out of 21 or 23, 21 or 22, only 4 or 5 functions. So the issue is that, the problem first is that whether you are affording them sufficient space to operate or not. This is one problem. The second is whether they have the capacity. That point has been raised by almost all of us, that whether they have the capacity or not. The third is that, a private investment has its own limitations, because they look more towards the revenue streams, future revenue streams. So they are, our local bodies, even at the state government level, they have not the capacity to prepare the projects which would be of interest for the private funding agencies. But the most important point I would like to mention also is that, well, that point we have missed somewhere, that the free beer we are distributing, that probably the user charges you mentioned. Yes, you mentioned user charges. So user charges, the very important point which has been raised. Property tax is also a very important point. But the distribution of the free beers, and that is the careless, I tell you, in Punjab and in several other states, free electricity. And those who are paying ₹1,00,000 a month as income tax, they are getting free electricity without any bill. Now the issue under these circumstances, when you have got a big source to move, big source to mobilize sources, why don't you do it? And then, this subnational level, since the functions have not been properly allocated, funds have not been allocated, they do not have any capacity at the highest level. There is no thinking about it. Probably there is much more concentration of funds and the power at the, highest level. I think we need to look more towards the internal, our subnational government, internal functioning of the government, internal sources, capacity building, and the government also should come forward for investing, right? So with these, I am really thankful to all these eminent scholars, and they have really raised some pertinent points. And the best part of it is that there is a consensus among all these people. There maybe some other viewpoint also, but that is outside the hall, or maybe amongst our participants sitting over there. But as far as the panelists is concerned, they have the arguments to put forward, and I'm convinced that whatever has been said is right, and it is unanimous and it is acceptable. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so
So you were traveling with us probably in the same place yesterday night.
Yes, Indigo.
Indigo. You were working with the laptop. I was looking at on urbanization. You were doing something. Always working. He was very busy doing. I was trying to look at him. I thought he is from Niti Yoga.
It is something for Niti Aayog.
That's why Niti Yoga.
Niti Aayog.
I was about to mention this.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Maybe we should have a group picture or something like that.
Thank you.
Should have a group picture.
If we can have a group picture, अरे साहब एक ग्रुप पिक्चर हमारी कर दीजिए, हैं? ग्रुप फोटो कर दीजिए, आइए साहब इधर बीच में आ जाते हैं सभी लोग.
He'll come in the middle then. I'm coming. 1 minute. I think 1 second.
Yeah, please come close. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, should we
You
go
need
for
to
a
share
photograph?
this with us. Yeah.
Should we go for a group photograph? Yeah, let us come here. Yes. You know, I-
Welcome, Dr. Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Oh, yes. I can hear you.
Yes. We're waiting for an audience for you. We're collecting people to listen to us.
Very good. I'll wait patiently. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Shelley, are you there? Shelley? Shelley Kedia? Shelley Kedia is not. She's not there. Okay. This is what they gave me. I think, good afternoon, everyone. I think we should begin because we are under a very tight leash from the organizers on the time that is being allowed to us. We have this track 3, Green Energy and Logistics. I am Sindhushri Khullar. I am a former Chief Executive Officer of the Niti Aayog. I have with me a very distinguished panel, Dr. Noura Mansoori, Fellow of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, Mr. Preetam Banerjee on my left, Logistics Specialist Consultant, Asian Development Bank, Dr. Priyadarshi Das, Associate Professor at the RIS, New Delhi, Dr. Schwartz, who's online. Welcome, Dr. Schwartz. Harsh Chaturvedi, Associate Professor, School of Energy Sciences and Engineering, IIT Guwahati, and Mr. Chandra Bhushan, President and CEO, International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. Now, we have about 40 minutes, and I would, instead of laying out the issues, I would like the issues to emerge from the comments made by the panelists. So that if there is time, which I hope there would be, we'll start a discussion from the floor that would be hopefully of interest to all of us, rather than my laying out the issues and the others trying to say something. So without further ado, I will request Dr. Noura Mansoori to kick off the panel on basically climate change and logistics, but we are all looking from what we heard this morning on transitions, on various kinds of transitions leading to the one future outcome. That is one earth, one family, one future outcome. And that one future can only be, as we heard, if we all change and we change our ways. So, Noura.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure for me to be here. My name is Noura Mansoori. I'm a fellow at CAPSARC, which is an advisory think tank based in Saudi Arabia. I'm also co-chairing Task Force 3 on Life. And I was the lead co-chair under the T20 Saudi Arabia, and I continued that role under the Italian and Indonesian and now Indian presidency. So it's a pleasure to represent that continuity in climate and energy topics. I'd like to lay out the challenges that we have ahead of us in green transition and in energy and climate specifically. So the first point I'd like to make is that there is always a trade-off between energy ambitions and climate goals. Of course, we have the 17 SDGs. We are not on track to meet many of these. I'll focus specifically on energy access, which is SDG 7, to provide affordable and clean energy. Unfortunately, 13% of the global population still lacks access to modern electricity. We still have traditional fuels that are being used in cooking, creating lots of health and environmental challenges. On the other hand, we are still not on track to meet the temperature goals, the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, where the global average temperature has already increased to 1.26 degrees Celsius. So we have these competing challenges that we should be aware of. And on top of all of that, we have economic developmental challenges, particularly for the Global South. And given that this G20 presidency of India is highlighting and pushing further the agenda of the Global South, we must consider principles that are creating the just energy transition, such as the common but differentiated principle. My second point is to learn from the recent challenges that the world has undergone. Specifically, the last year and the year before, the health challenges, COVID-19, and what it brought with it, from raising, the inflation, disrupting the energy supplies, disrupting utilities, raising the fuel prices, and of course, impacting health worldwide. And the second is the geopolitical tensions that happened last year, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and how it impacted also energy supplies, fuel, food prices, as well as supply chains. So these global upheavals that are impacting the pace and scale of the energy transition. So the idea here and the lesson really is that climate change loses salience when we are faced with energy security. The third point is that, particularly for the global south, is to keep all the energy options open. Energy technologies that offer mitigation solutions should be valued equally, and there should not be any discrimination against or for any kind of energy transition. So energy technologies. So investments across all energy technologies is important. All the forms are important. I'd like to highlight here the circular carbon economy framework, which was formulated under the Saudi G20 presidency in 2020 and was endorsed by all the G20 countries. It's important to preserve the continuity from one presidency to the next. And the circular carbon economy offers a new way of mitigating climate change. It offers a flexible, dynamic, inclusive, and pragmatic approach to climate action, where it values every effort for climate mitigation. It encourages all the energy technologies and investments across all the energy technologies. And it's based on the 4 R's pathways: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. And I'd like to talk a little bit here about LIFE, which is the important framework that's proposed by T20 India this year and G20 India, which I am co-chairing, this task force 3 that I'm co-chairing. And LIFE, as was defined by the Prime Minister, is based on the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle at an individual level. Something that we can do, and this is my recommendation really for T20 India and G20, is to build on the efforts that were have already been approved and endorsed by the G20, such as the circular carbon economy. Both have their roots in circular economy and can be applied. You know, the circular carbon economy, although has not been explored at the individual, can indeed be applied and deployed at the individual level to encourage reducing, reusing, recycling, and removing carbon through individual lifestyle for the environment, and also at the national level and also international level. And I'll keep it here. I know the time is up, and looking forward to discussing these ideas and exchanging ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. I think that you did lay the base for the other speakers to build on, and the issue that there needs to be continuity between the presidencies so that thematic coherence continues and G20 goes forward in meeting the agenda and its goals, keeping the Indian formulation very much as the center focus. I'll now ask Mr. Preetham Banerjee, Logistics Specialist, Consultant, Asian Development Bank, to make his remarks.
Thank you very much. That continues to be a G20 priority, given that we are still in the post-pandemic recovery phase. And of course, as was pointed out by the previous speaker, we are seeing disruptions of different kinds emerge in different parts of the world, some political, some health related all the time. With that in mind, I'll simply like to introduce 3 very pointed ideas which perhaps could be part of the dialogue within G20 to drive greater supply chain efficiency. The first one is on the resilience part, where we all know that the weakest link in the supply chain defines it. And there needs to be understanding of what the critical supply chains are that are important and critical for human health, human life, and as well as for the critical inputs to the global economy. We typically know what those supply chains are. In order to make them resilient, there needs to be micro-level mapping of the choke points of those supply chains, which is possible. And there, while many countries have good examples, a recent one that India has implemented is the Prime Minister's Gati Shakti Master Plan, which looks at a geospatial mapping of supply chains, of logistics infrastructure, and understanding where the choke points are. A global cooperation based on such platforms could help. And that would be, those could identify the critical investment projects for those weakest links. And there, the G20 could perhaps bring together their investment, create a platform for concentrated investment to address the challenges. The second very low-hanging fruit is to perhaps aim for completely paperless trade. So complete digitalization of all documents used in trade. And the good news is that there are already existing frameworks. We have the Asia Pacific UNESCAP framework agreement for facilitation of cross-border, paperless cross-border trade. We have the model law on electronic transfer of records by the UNICTRAL. So there are existing instruments that are there which could be adapted. The key challenge is that there have been private sector initiatives to, create this kind of end-to-end paperless systems for international trade. They have typically not succeeded because of trust issues, which means you have national digital silos, which, where people are willing to exchange documents because they are certified by the government of that country. But how do you then move it between these, national digital silos? Maersk, which is a major shipping line, tried to do that. It wasn't successful for trust deficit issues. I think there the G20 could work towards creating those kind of standards for secure digital exchange of documents, which any system can adopt, and that becomes certified and people can create trust, and then you have the end-to-end solutions. Last but not the least, I want to make a somewhat controversial point, and this is related to the entire idea of how does G20 support an equitable development outcome even through supply chain interventions. What we saw happen during the pandemic was that we saw huge jumps in freight rates, especially container freight rates. They went up 7 to 9 times the normal averages. Now, of course, some of them were explained by general disruption to the supply chain, lack of manpower due to lockdowns, etc. There were lots of choke points being created. But many studies point to the fact that a lot of these increases were disproportionate to these, operational reasons because of pure rent seeking. Because you have, firms, dominant firms who control air and ocean freights, and despite best efforts in multilateral forums like WTO and other places, we don't have international rules to manage competition and create transparency in these kind of markets. There is an existing mechanism which, because of such concerns on maritime trade, that already has started since 2014, called the G3 Regulators Forum on Maritime Industry, where the maritime regulators of China, EU, and US meet on a biennial basis to discuss competition issues. Low-hanging fruit could be that this is extended to the G20 members, the other countries as well, because as we have seen, the countries which have been the most receiving end, critical receiving end of such huge freight rates increases have been developing countries like India and others. So these are some very kind of low-lying fruits that could be picked, perhaps as a part of the discussions in G20, where as a part of the ministerial outcome we could target transparency, resilient supply chains through mapping, and full paperless trade by a certain deadline using existing international instruments that we have. With those remarks, ma'am, back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Preetham. You have laid out the issues on major issues relating to supply chain disruptions, and we will hopefully link it to the energy transitions that need to take place. And hopefully in these transitions, they will be more climate friendly. The recently unveiled logistics policy at least has recognized these issues in its own way in India by the Indian government. And I think as we move forward internationally in the G20, this could be a focus on how to build climate friendly logistics frameworks. And again, as I said, we go back to the issue of how we build on the transitions or how we go through the transitions, leading to the ultimate one of lifestyle changes. I'll request Dr. Priyadarshi Das, Associate Professor RIS, to make his remarks.
Thank you, Chair. Our fellow panelists on the dais are all connected virtually. In the interest of time, as instructed by the Chair, just flagging some key issues and probably the recommendations flowing from that. I'll be basically covering the financing of aspects of this particular area. When we start thinking about green energy or say climate resilience, the financing frameworks also needs to change. And in fact, it is changing. But there are a lot of areas where risk perception with respect to those projects are still very high. So perceived risks about certain infrastructure projects in general and green projects, in the earlier session, Chair was referring to revenue stream. That is perhaps one of the impediments which prevents the private investors should be to forthcome in the beginning and invest in such high budget projects. So that public investment has to happen, then crowding effect perhaps would work. So that is one area. Second, when we talk about climate financing, the conventional instruments of funding, the administrative procedures involved with the bond issuance and other are changing. So there was a study a couple of years back by ADB that the bond issuance, green bond issuance cost in the initial years would be high because the system that the bureaucracy or the administrative procedures involved in issuing the conventional bonds and then the green bonds, because green bonds would require ESG compliance. Environmental, social, and governance variables needs to be satisfied both at the DPR level and post sanctioning of the projects. So how to see that becomes seamless in the process. And one major impediment in the field of infrastructure finance has been infrastructure has still not been viewed as an asset class. That is a major reform that we should be doing. And we have been talking about for past 20 years. A typical financial asset is seen as a return fetching asset. So unless we make infrastructure an attractive investment proposition, we can't really promote the green bonds or all sorts of the market for that. Of course, the number of issuance of bonds and the volume mobilized has increased in Asia, in many countries. Private investors are having money. They don't want to invest in high risk projects because the initial investment has to be guaranteed by the public sector. Institutional investors like pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies like LIC of India, they have huge money. I think as per an estimate, not less than 90 trillion globally, the institutional investors are sitting with that amount of money. But why are they not investing in infrastructure? Forget about green energy and other projects. Because they are not finding the kind of risk return package where they can diversify their investment. So one-time investment, the sunk cost could be high. If the project becomes uncertain, the revenue stream become uncertain, or they're not finding the way, co-financing options should be there. MDBs, institutional investors, individual large private investors. So co-funding opportunities should be worked out in a way that everybody bears some part of the risk so that not a single investor is adequately or sufficiently exposed to the market. Then in the particular logistics sector, like cross-border regional energy grids or something, like RIS is doing some work under the South Asia Group for Energy. We are talking about the energy market in South Asia. So how to promote energy trade? What type of work needs to be done? Both financing and the point Mr. Banerjee was referring to, the end-to-end paperless system, or say for example, in the case of BIMSTEC Motor Vehicle Act, the movement of rules regulation with respect to movement of trucks in the BIMSTEC countries are different. So unless you sort it out, the project will get stuck somewhere, and it has happened actually. Because the movement of trucks would not happen unless that country allows that, as per their rule, the truck mobility should happen. The trilateral highway project between India, Thailand, Myanmar, I have gone to the other side of the border in Myanmar side. We heard the same thing, that certain bridges, widening of the bridges is happening slow because the regulations of India, regulations of Myanmar, regulations of Thailand, so it has to be harmonized some way. So we have to find the way to do that. I think I'll end with this. One more point, madam. Also, you find in literature, unless there is the underwriting of the green bonds, which will assure the market that there is better prospects in terms of the risks and other things are managed. There will be also speculation, or there will be not much interest in investing in this because these are not well traded assets so far in the market. And AIAB and NDB, being new generation banks, are promoting sustainable bonds and green bonds in a big way. So we can see that the financing frameworks, the regulations, harmonization of those, and encouraging private investors to go for co-funding models, if not their own. With this, I stop, madam.
Thank you, Dr. Dash. You have raised the key issue on financing and on the contradictions and challenges within each element in that financing chain as they exist, and gone on to how it links to the variations in regulations, laws, basically pointing to how borders create impediments in logistics and movement of goods and services. Services, we are all aware it's extraordinarily complex. But again, in trying to link climate change and logistics together, we are looking at challenges which seem right now to be involving changes in the way we look at financing, the way we look at infrastructure, the way we look at movements across borders or within the borders. I will now request Dr. Schwartz, welcome. You've been waiting patiently for and listening to us. Dr. Schwartz is Senior Advisor, Development Cooperation Directorate, OECD Paris, and he's joining us.
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, and thanks, RIS, for the invitation to speak, and also very nice to see you, Dr. Dash. And thanks for just speaking about the financing aspect, which allows me to continue. I wanted to say a couple of words about climate finance, and it was also said in the previous session to which I had the chance of listening that the needs are higher than the available funds, that we see a shortage of financing. So what we need is also that the G20 promotes more transformative approaches. When it comes to climate finance, we know, of course, that much of the normative aspects are linked in the UNFCCC, but the G20 certainly also can advance certain principles and perhaps also normative aspects so that we see more change happening. When we speak about climate finance, of course, it's not just international finance, but also local and national finance. And it's, of course, also public and private. And one particular aspect I want to stress, blended finance. Let me just give briefly two figures where the challenge lies. Our OECD analysis shows that of climate finance, only 17% is provided to LDCs and only 2% to small island developing states. We know that these countries are particularly or most affected by climate change. And second figure I wanted to share is that we know on the overall mobilization and the goal of the $100 billion goal is key. Our latest data shows that between 2019 and 2020, climate finance grew, but not yet to the 100 billion. So we are at 83.3 billion, we estimate. So more needs to be done. We are still short of it. So that requires that several actors work together and that the G20 uses all its power to mobilize these actors, whether these are development partners, beneficiary countries, or the private sector or public development banks. We have done some studies that show also that development effectiveness principles can help to provide a useful benchmark for helping to scale up climate finance. But let me give you some concrete thoughts where the G20 could perhaps continue. And I think this is also inspired, Ms. Kula, what you said about the need for continuity of G20 presidencies. The G20, for example, could continue to promote approaches and tools that leverage both the public and the private effort to build SDG sectors, for example, on blended and climate finance. Last year, for example, under Indonesian presidency, the G20 adopted blended finance principles. How can these be taken forward now that they have been adopted, for example, with a focus on the Indian presidency on life? Is there a possibility where sort of the development agenda and the climate agenda can be brought together? Dr. Dash also mentioned green bonds. This was a topic which was very high on the agenda of the Italian G20 presidency in the development track then. And at the time, it was the work showed that public development banks have a crucial role in making the issuance of green bonds happen. Again, the reference was made to the huge potential in India. Again, maybe there's a possibility to continue some of the previous work and to work on this. The final point I wanted to make is that the G20 has also a responsibility and a possibility of contributing to a mindset change. We need to move much more to an SDG financing mindset and not see this as a liability, but as a possibility. The Indian colleagues have asked us to study in detail, and we are conducting this research at the moment of seeing where are bottlenecks in the multinational development finance system. And some of these, and we heard this also already just now, some of these are in the financial area, but others are also non-financial in nature. So we need to look to advance, not just to increase finance capacity, for example, of public development banks or multinational development banks, but also to look where can more coherence, more coordination be advanced, and also how can we advance more transparency with that goal of contributing towards more climate finance, which can then enable, as you, Madam Chair, said at the beginning, these green transitions. So with these thoughts, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. You have moved the discussion forward and taken it to where we are heading to the transitional and the mindset changes that we are looking at, and while keeping the continuity and the major goal that we all are looking at, which is the climate friendly or climate change, which is the climate change, as we were informed, is already on us. So what we are really looking at is a future which takes care of further non-deterioration, if such a bad word, further that it doesn't deteriorate any further, and whatever we do going forward is with this central message that we have to have a future which belongs to the next generation. I will invite Dr. Harsh Chaturvedi, Associate Professor, School of Energy Sciences and Engineering, IIT Guwahati. Dr. Chaturvedi.
Thank you, ma'am. So since the time is very short, I'll put it into three ways. One are some of my suggestions, and then I'll probably end up with the questions left for all of you to answer for all of us on the planet. So the energy, as we are discussing right now, is solely on the consumer electronics or consumption electricity, what we are probably aiming at. But energy being a widespread area, I'll just try to focus on the renewable energy part of it, which is more climate resilient and much more greener for all of us. But before I start on this green energy, how green is this green energy? I think that has to be mapped out, which is not yet probably done. So we need to make sure that we have the proper indices, which can tell us how green are these greener energies. So there are green energies in hydro. There's a green energy in algae, bacteria. There's green energy in solar. There's green energy in wind. How greener are they? And that takes care of whole supply chain, which starts from raw material to technology adaptation to consumer electronics to everything else forward. So like we had for the GST as a mechanism, I think we need to start thinking from the start to the end consumers in terms of energies and the energy balances and the credit system, which we are looking forward for. Talking about India, it's quite happy, or I mean, privileged or proud to share. I think we have moved up a lot in the climate change performance index. I think in terms of G20 countries, we are top right now in terms of climate change performance index. So there are models of growth. There are models of repeatability, which we need to take forward and also learn from each other. There are best practices which are existing across the globe, especially in the G20 countries. We may have shared same problems. We may have different solutions for it. I think that all needs to be optimized for the local conditions. And India being a widespread geographically variable climate across from Himalayas to Sundarbans and deltas and everything, I think we can have very localized models of governance which can be taken forward across, mapping it with the countries which need those kind of solutions which exist locally. Since this conference is about life values and well-being, I think energy encompasses every or most of the aspects of our lives. So like was shown in the today morning in the meeting, the ecotourism thing, which was shown by, I think, Professor Li Xiaohong from China, that Miao Village, I think those kinds of models exist locally in India too, which needs to be taken up further. And if they are very inspiring or mapping up to the localized solutions across the globe, I think they can take it forward. So before, since the time is short, I will just quickly point out a few questions of interest to all of us. Energy storage is a big economical bottleneck for the energy transition which we are talking about. The renewable energies depends mostly on the energy storage, which is the high component, financial component. And I think how the different technologies of batteries, manufacturing, which is adaptable, and what locally is accessible. So maybe we don't have lithium, but we have sulfur, right? So the countries need to focus more on what kind of raw materials we have, indigenous technology we develop, and how we can share those technologies across the partner countries. So the technological sharing, I think that's one of the important aspects. How we can cooperate more on intellectual properties. I think that is one of the important aspects which we can share around. The modalities of things have to be worked out at the policy level. But I think these are some of the suggestions which can help us take the models which exist in India to the globe across, and also learn from the globe which are the best practices existing in locally to make it forward compliant and map it out to the conditions of India which needs those kind of policies and models. Moving on to, there are three important things. One is education, which integrates this energy and gives us the human resource and also the awareness at the grassroots level. So what we are looking out for are the entrepreneurs or the startups or the things like this, which promotes, but it also gives awareness to the local people. So if we have a lot of these solutions which are coming locally, involving local students, getting them IPRs and things like this, that makes locally, that solves the local problems, but also has mapped out global problems. So what we are talking about is local solutions for global problems and also learning it backwards. Finally, I'll just take a few minutes more. We think we need to have some kind of a common repository where the best mechanism and the best practices are put on place so that we have a lot more to share across and develop it together so we can build up joint programs which can help us build up both the technology and share those IPRs across the globes in a more reasonable way. Before we end, I think what I'm looking for in 3 words or 6 words, right, is technologies which are feasible, economically viable, and ecologically responsible. I think with those 3 words, I would like to end my session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi, for that extremely succinct summation at the end. You have in many ways said it all, and each word will carry a huge amount of weight in feasibility, viability, and responsibility. Responsibility, I think, in the end is the key to what we are all aiming at. Our last speaker for this is Mr. Chandrabhushan, CEO and President, International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. When I was invited to Bhopal, I had a very different sense about this track. Okay? Because life, as it was propounded by India's Prime Minister, and the discussion that happened in Niti Aayog had to do with individual responsibility on environment. So the full form of life, as I understand, is lifestyle for environment. And we are discussing in this session green energy and logistics. So for me, there are 3 critical words here: life, green energy, and logistics. And my understanding is that I should be talking about how we as an individual can reduce our environmental footprint related to energy and logistics. That's my understanding of this session. Maybe I'm wrong. It looks like, because the general discussion has not been on this topic, but nevertheless, it is important for me to put my point through. So from carbon footprint point of view, 3/4 of all our footprint, individual footprint, is energy and transport. And therefore, if we want to solve climate change, we will have to reduce our carbon footprint of energy and logistics. Now, at COP27 at Sharm el Sheikh, for the first time, and I was very pleasantly surprised, for the first time there was discussion on phasing out all fossil fuels. There was always discussion on phasing out coal. And we have seen that discussion happening over the last 10 years. Last year, we have seen just energy transition deal between Indonesia, South Africa, now Vietnam, to phase down coal. But the fact is, coal is only about 30% of the carbon footprint of energy. We have oil and gas. That too needs to be phased down over a period of time. So the first thing is, I do believe that lifestyle for environment will require over a period of time for us, maybe 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades, to phase down fossil fuel for combustion sector. We can continue to use fossil fuels in chemical industry or other industry where carbon emission is not there. But fundamentally, the idea that we can continue burning fossil fuel and do something with carbon capture and storage is not going to work. And therefore, we think we need to phase down fossil fuel. That's one way to look at it. And the discussion has started, and maybe that discussion is something that we can continue at G20. The second is, we can keep building infrastructure, roads and airports and ports, but at the end of the day, there has to be discussion on sufficiency. We all understand that efficiency is not sufficiency. There's a limit to efficiency. And therefore, I think our production and consumption cannot be only about transporting goods across the world or within the country as well. And I'm happy to say that there's a lot of discussion in India on vocal for local. Prime Minister has talked about it. There's a lot of discussion on how do we meet a lot of our requirements, and we can, from water to food to raw materials, how much we can meet locally so that we have to reduce our transportation requirement. That's a discussion that should also happen. Lastly, I do believe that there's huge potential for zero carbon transport. So whatever we need to transport sector is primed for transition. Railways in India will become zero carbon by 2035. That's what Government of India has announced. Railway will move to renewable energy. Electric vehicle is going to become a reality. As far as freight transport is concerned, we will move to hydrogen. This is a sector which is primed for transition. And I think that's the second thing that we can do. We can start talking about transitioning the transport sector out of internal combustion engine to more electric motors. 2 points where the discussion has happened, which I was not planning to address, but I thought that I will put my view as well. One was on finance. I think till the time we do not address the perverse logic of the market, the current logic of the market is, if you are more vulnerable, you pay more. And therefore, Bangladesh has the highest, more interest rate of the global capital than India, and Tanzania far more than anyone else. Now, this is a perverse logic of the market, simply because Bangladesh and Tanzania has not contributed to climate change. So the countries who are going to suffer because of climate change will have to pay the most for international capital. Those countries will also have to pay the most for any sort of insurance. And therefore, large part of Africa cannot afford renewable energy. Now, till we address this perverse logic of the market, I don't think supplying capital to developing country is going to be sufficient. And the last point, Madam Chairperson, is that all the transition must be just and inclusive, which means that for the first time in history of the world, we will be talking about transition, which is at the intersection of labor, environment, and human rights. And this intersection must be understood, debated, and discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are now really, as I said, dug so deep that we are swimming in deep waters, because every issue that has been presented by the panelists requires not just 5 minutes, but probably drilling down on each aspect and how eventually they come together and become the circular framework which you began with. But we can cheat a little bit, I think, and I would invite comments from the floor for 5 minutes, 5 or 7 minutes. I'm looking at my timekeeper. She's saying yes. So wonderful. So may I, please? Yes, please. It would be nice if you let others also speak. So keep your comments
I'll
short.
keep it very brief. I'm Mishra from Hyderabad. Now, there is a move that in India itself will issue rupee green bonds. And the volume is expected to be about 10,000 crore. And maybe I think much more. And all the companies, they'll be assessed, on this climate change and ESG issues. And such companies, I think, will be allowed to approach the market, Indian market. And I'm sure that I think people who are flush with funds, of course, there'll be some concessions there. They'll invest the money. So money is, I don't think is a problem. We have been saying that unless we get money from abroad or, from a different kind of funds, I don't think, we are not trying to understand the issue. There is, I think, a lot of money within the G20 group itself.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like, please, Dr. Khosla.
Thank you. And I work in India on alternatives. And I'm also the chairperson of the Global Council for Sustainable Hydropower. We've spent the last 15 years since the World Commission on Dams in setting up a standard for sustainability, which tries to ensure that all hydropower in the future will be sustainable according to all the issues that we consider important. I think it's important to recognize that hydropower, which has had a very bad name, has to be part of the solution, because the other renewables like solar and wind are intermittent, and we're going to need pumped storage. We're going to need reservoir-based dams to provide a certain amount of continuity, peak power, and base load. So the issues that have come up in our work on making these standards, I think apply to a lot of the other infrastructure and energy sources. And I think one of the important things in order to keep the costs down and keep the impact at a minimum will be to establish such standards for all energy sources. So I would like really to recommend strongly that be a part of the solution in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a very key issue. And in the G20 forum, which hopes to create borderless regulations, this could be adoption of standards, particularly for environmentally fragile areas in particular, would be a very important ingredient in this exercise. Yes, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm Alok Chaturvedi. I'm a professor of management at Purdue University. So one idea which we have is, what if we created a green bond exchange for financing, refinancing, and trading? So that way, the banks which has invested in a project, so now they can turn around and tokenize their contract, which can be bought by retail investors, and then they can trade. So, I mean, this is something which is different from the standard crypto, where it is asset backed. So that is one of the things which we are working on, and that as research, and so that is something, which we can look at more seriously.
Thank you. We look forward to some more light on this when you are ready to share the research that comes across. Yeah, please.
Yeah, this is my question is to Nora and to Professor Chaturvedi, talking about green energy transition and the others also. Basically, as Nora, you began your presentation by talking about the fallout of the crisis in Ukraine and the COVID crisis on the energy issue. I think one of the major problems that we are facing because of the Ukraine crisis specifically is that energy security suddenly become paramount globally. So while there is a talk about moving, a faster transition, but there are others who are also talking about continuing use of fossil fuels. Countries like China are increasing their coal production. Countries would earlier said that they would, decrease their production of coal. So how do we deal with these issues? Because obviously, energy security is not an either or option, especially for those people in. That's what conflict like Ukraine has brought to people who are living closer to the theater of war and facing the energy crisis as they are. So, how do we deal with these real-term issues? What we are planning for future is obviously something which would be a better world, whether at an individual basis or at a government-to-government level. But how do we deal with the current realities?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. It's a very important question. It's a real challenge that we all lived last year. So I'd like to take us back to COP26 in Glasgow, when countries made pledges to reduce the use of fossil fuels, namely coal, and also the other climate targets that are put forth, particularly by the G20 and the G7 countries. Fast forward to February, just 3 months after the pledge was made, the conflict broke out between Russia and Ukraine, impacting energy supplies, impacting Russian hydrocarbons imports by Europe, and some European countries reverting back to coal to replace Russian hydrocarbons. So this is actually the lesson here, that if you, first of all, if you create an energy transition strategy that doesn't allow for the flexibility, the transition becomes abrupt, it becomes disorderly, it becomes expensive. And second is that energy security raises to the top of the agenda, and climate change loses salience. National security, energy security always comes first. So this teaches us the importance of having a dynamic, inclusive, reliable, and most importantly, resilient climate action that would wither global upheavals, whether it's COVID-19 or geopolitical tensions. And the circular carbon economy, which I have elaborated on, offers exactly that. It offers this resilient climate action that's inclusive and that takes into account national circumstances and resources endowment, and allows for the much needed flexibility and dynamism in energy technologies. So investments across all energy options is important, and each country should decide for itself what its roadmap towards meeting its climate target is, that goes along with its national security strategy and energy security strategy. Thank you.
I forgot to mention my name. I'm Ruchita Berry from the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Thank you.
Yes, I was just going to request the panelists, Dr. Chaturvedi and yourself, last comments before we conclude.
I think we need to differentiate between short-term shock and long-term plan. That's important. What is happening in Europe, in my mind, is short-term shock. But if it will remain a short-term shock if Europe does a long-term planning. Okay, I'm not sure that Europe is looking at long-term plan, but the current coal in Europe, in my mind, is short-term. But Europe will have to do massive investment in efficiency first. It is a highly energy inefficient economy. The buildings are outdated. Europe can easily reduce its energy consumption by 40 to 50% if it invests in efficiency. And then it can move to cleaner sources of energy. Similarly, for a country like India, I think we will have increase in fossil fuel for a few years. We will plateau and then we will come down. But for that, we need 20-30-year plan that we need to put in place now. to get that. So I think I'm not that worried about Europe started using coal now because of Ukraine. That's in my mind, and for many of the analysts, it's a short-term shock that we are seeing.
I think we need to map our local potentials with the indigenously developed technology, which can be globally shared, right? So we have the indigenous potential, which will be ours. So that keeps safe of our integrities. Technology which is indigenously developed makes you use that potential. So it has not to be country specific, but it can be regional specific, as if we are looking at a country like India. So the local potentials which are regionally specific, technology which is indigenously developed, and best practice which is globally shared. I think that's what we can do.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very valuable contributions from the House and my fellow panelists. I think we have, as I said, plumbed the depths right now of such major issues that we have all a great deal to think about. The key issues here seem to be that energy sources, each one of them has its own hazards as well as its what should I say, its potential. And financing climate friendly infrastructure, making sure that logistics frameworks are equally supportive of that climate friendly infrastructure. And most important of all, in keeping international standards. And that's something which I think G20 can contribute the most, is to ensure that standards exist and that they are adhered to across in this transitions that we are talking about. Eventually, the transition will have to be at the individual level. Whether that leads the way or that is a consequence of all the transitions that take place. I think that is a very big question and far too deep to debate in such a short time. Thank you all again very, very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Honorable Madam Chair, and thanks to every panelist who have made this session really interactive. And also to Dr. Ralph. So we sign off and we join to the next session going on in the mail hall. Thank you so much.